interrupt your conversation, leave the door open for 5 minutes, not to check whether Elijah will arrive, but just to check lost students. He is welcome. He is welcome. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Reverend Bill Schwartz, who I met probably 5 or 6 years ago at one of the interfaith conferences in Doha, but got to know more recently. Bill is remarkable for many reasons. One is he's one of the few Americans who has an OBE from who awarded it to you at the ceremony? The ambassador, or did you do it?
The ambassador. Well, I could have come.
Yeah.
But we chose to do it in Saudi with the people that
you know and love.
We did, yeah.
Which is a real tribute to his work. He has spent the last 30 plus years of his life in the Middle East, in the Gulf, in Cyprus, and comes back and forth occasionally. He has the wonderful title of being the Deacon of the Gulf. Archdeacon of the Gulf. And has also written quite an interesting little book on Islam, specifically I think for Christians in that part of the world.
Yeah, and I have copies.
Called Islam, a Religion, a Culture and a Society. Now, Bill's going to talk to us for about 30 minutes or so on his perspective as a Christian minister living in the Gulf. He has a number of ministers under him in different places, some of whom I've had the privilege to meet. Bill has also connected with the Wolf Institute through one of our research projects, which is based in Qatar, with Georgetown, which looks at how one evaluates the impact of interfaith. How do you know it's a success or a failure? Some of us has devoted much of our lives to it, and certainly the Wolf Institute does, so we'd like to think it's a success, but we need to know how and why and when it's a failure. And that's based in Doha, and John Fahy is the leading researcher on that and has connections with Bill. But with no further ado, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you in my home rather than to be in your home. And we look forward to hearing from you as your perspectives, your reflections on what it's like to be a Christian minister living in Qatar and in that region.
Okay. Thank you. Just in terms of background, I came to the Middle East in 1972 and was in and out and have lived there consistently since the fall of '75. My first 5 years were in Egypt, and my job was dealing with one of these study abroad for a term, first as a student and then managing the program. So I've climbed to the top of the Great Pyramid 7 times. It's been an adventure. We moved to Cyprus for a year, ended up staying for 22. And we were in Saudi for 8 years, and we have been in Qatar now for almost 9 years. It's been an interesting shift from the Levant, or Shams if you're speaking in Arabic, to the Gulf. And I was very interested with the comment about I've been to the Middle East. Yes, but it's like saying I was in London, so I've been to Europe. The Gulf is a very different world from the Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestinian history. And particularly in terms of religious history, there are, of course, pre-Christian and then Christian heritage and then Islamic heritage, so you've got overlays. And William Dalrymple did a wonderful book about that overlay aspect of the interaction of the cultures. But in the Gulf, that which has Christian heritage was obliterated. And modern Gulf society has come to be without any reference for anything other than Islam. Except maybe for Oman, because Oman was a seafaring nation, and they had, of course, the connection in Zanzibar. But in fact, my first conversation when I went to Qatar, I should back up just a little bit, say that the government of Qatar was wholly under the thumb of Saudi Arabia until the mid-90s, when the petrochemical industry attained a development to make natural gas liquefied and therefore marketable. Because Qatar's resources are in natural gas, offshore natural gas, as opposed to the liquid petroleum version. And because it wasn't marketable, it was still a very poor nation. And since the mid-90s, Qatar has catapulted into the 21st century. Everything about Qatar is new. I use 3 words to describe Qatar: shiny, ambitious, and elite. That's how they see themselves. But I don't want to spend all my time in Qatar because my responsibilities give me the opportunity to travel extensively. My archdeaconry covers Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula, and I can't visit one of the other parishes except by phone. It's a big area, and we don't have a lot of churches as Anglicans, but in each place we have a very interesting dimension. And Qatar, I'll speak for Qatar because I know it best. When the government decided they were going to allow churches, which what happened in 2003, and the leases were signed in 2005. They originally started with 5 church identities, and then developed into 6. But so I was asked to go there, negotiate with the government about everything to do with the design and the building contracts and all those kinds of things for permissions, and then to raise $10 million and oversee the building project, and by the way, keep the congregation going in the meantime. My first conversation, sit down with the government representative, and the name of the church will be the Church of England. And I said, excuse me, can't be. Can't be the Church of England, except in England. It's not the Church of England in Wales or in Scotland. And he asked, well, what do you call yourselves? And so I spoke to him in Arabic, and he was delighted. And as it turned out, he didn't understand what I said because he has no Christian vocabulary. And we spent the next half hour, me, teaching him Christian vocabulary in Arabic. He thought it was a hoot. He was just laughing, and it was a great time. We had good fun. He became a good friend. But I say that as indicative that there is no cultural fluency from Gulf Arabs for Christian, much less Jewish background. And so the whole business of establishing church identity there has been quite an adventure. Unlike Kuwait or Oman or Bahrain, where Christian missionaries brought medicine and education to the country in the 1890s. And they're greatly respected because they're the ones who came before air conditioning, which is no small matter. So that you have this very interesting sense of heritage, which builds in. And one of the things that I've had to struggle with in terms of the Qatar experience of building the church is people are very interested in building a church. And I'm trying to explain to them, we're not building a building so that we have a place to worship. We're building a building so that people who come here 50 years from now have a place to worship. The church must think beyond the immediacy. And so, over the years, the experience that I've been accumulating has then, if I might say, uniquely qualified me for the bishop to say, take care of this, take care of that. And so I deal with governments, property matters, the recruitment of clergy when one retires and we need a new one, things like that. That's the kind of thing that occupies my time, aside from refereeing when people fight with each other and things like that. But in each of these places, the church that we have built in Qatar and Bahrain and Oman, throughout the Emirates, is an accommodation. And we have, again, speaking specifically of Qatar, 75 Christian congregations who use the building we built. And we'll see 15,000 people on Friday, which in that country is the day of worship. And we're talking multitudes of languages. It's not just, this one's a variant of, you've got your Presbyterian this and the other kind of Presbyterians. No, this is the Malayalam-speaking brethren and the Tagalog-speaking Pentecostals and the Igbo-speaking Church of the Redeemer. And some of the names are really quite interesting. because many of these congregations are formed entirely locally based on a person who has a sense of charismatic leadership and has drawn people in his language group. I was a his in this situation. And so a congregation is formed, but legally they need a place to worship. So we built to accommodate this. And this is what we as Anglicans have done throughout the Gulf. And when you read statistics about religious demographics in the Gulf, you'll see consistently 5% Christian. Of course, this is politically correct. And they don't release statistics. But I can tell you that there are millions of Christians in the GCC countries.
Just explain what GCC is.
Sorry?
Just explain GCC.
Sorry, the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's kind of like the Arab Gulf version of the EU. They're trying to develop a common currency, common policies on visas and labor policy and things like that. Because they're small countries, and trying to create a unified economy will help them in many things.
Is this information kind of stuff we can spread elsewhere, or is that to be kept in here?
This is fine.
Correct. Thank you.
Well, I should say, actually, it's a fair point, Rona, that the lecture's being filmed. So that if there's anything that anyone has a concern about or whatever, let us know afterwards. I should have said that at the beginning. I apologise to the person responsible for health and safety.
And by all means, interrupt me with questions. I'm fine. In fact, I'm going to stop as soon as I can, so that questions are better than me rambling on. The difference is our congregation in Iraq, which is all Iraqis, and there really aren't very many expats in Iraq. You're all probably very familiar with the press focus on the migrant workers in Qatar. And frankly, I think that's quite unfair, because the issues are the same throughout the GCC countries. And frankly, the issues are the same in the UK. Frankly. Almost all the people who are in the GCC countries are there because they want to be there. And it's an improvement on the home life they had before they came. The abuses that they face are largely from their own people in their home countries in the recruitment process. They were recruited and given a contract, and they get there and find that's not the same contract that they thought they were going to get. Well, that's not the Qataris' fault. That's on the recruitment side. But the International Labor Organization is working very hard to kind of put this all together and to deal with it, and of course everybody wants to cooperate in that, including the governments in the Gulf. But that sense of migrant labor is also somewhat artificial. And I need to say that even an ambassador of the UK is a migrant laborer in the Gulf, right? This artificial thing that expats are the Westerners on big salaries and migrant laborers are the poor people on the low salaries is a totally artificial distinction. I need an exit visa to leave the country just like the guy from Bangladesh who sweeps the streets. The laws are the same. And needing to have an exit visa so you can leave the country is a little intimidating, but you develop a lifestyle that gets around it. And we've had this, we had it in Saudi, we had it in Qatar. You just get used to it and you plan. Sometimes you forget and you get to the airport and you can't go. Mad rush with a phone call and some other things. And sometimes it works in time, sometimes you have to take a later flight. It's easier for someone like myself because I am an American, and they're much more deferential to an American than they would be to a Pakistani or a Filipino. But nevertheless, the legal system is still the same. So the artificial distinction between what people call migrant laborers and expats is something that I would really like to dispel, and would like your help doing that when you speak to people about this whole ethos of the migrant labor issues. The migrant laborers are the church. Okay, there aren't Qataris who would be permitted, much less if they would want to come to church. And if they want to come to church, we would discourage it because it would put them in jeopardy. This is because of the tensions. of the idea that Muslims might convert to a non-Muslim religion. So the point is that there are millions of expats who are looking for freedom to worship, opportunity for worship, and for the most part, it's not a problem. It's fun for me to talk to people and say, our biggest problem is we can't build churches fast enough for the number of people that are wanting to worship. We're not closing churches down and selling them off like it's happening here because they become redundant because of migration issues and rezoning of cities and things like that. Okay, I mean, you were talking about ancient history being changed because of modern development. We've got no ancient history, all modern history, and we can't keep up with it. So our challenges in terms of operating churches and ecumenically with other church partners it's very much a working together, and we meet together intentionally very, very often between the Orthodox and the Catholics, Anglicans and other Protestants and things like this, to try to see how we can present, not necessarily unified, but at least a common identity of Christianity in the, I wouldn't say the larger Islamic context, but the dominant Islamic context. And speaking of Qatar, there are 10 foreigners for every citizen. Now think of what that means economically, socially, ethnically. I was talking about newspapers. It's difficult to make a profitable newspaper. For which language are you going to produce it in? The largest population group in Qatar is Indian. They outnumber the Qataris 2.5 to 1. So it's a very different scenario for doing church, but it's exciting and the opportunities are huge. And I was looking to recruit people to come because it's a great place to do and to be involved in ministry. It's especially a very interesting place to be involved in interfaith work because all of these countries are right now very, very concerned about the image of Islam. Daesh or ISIS is a great embarrassment to the Islamic leaders. I've been told by Muslims of stature, if I can call it that, they don't allow their teenage offspring to attend mosque because they're afraid they will be radicalized. This is a very real problem for Muslims, just as much as it is for the rest of the world who are worried about what this means. So it's a great opportunity to see how we can be cooperating about identity issues, social development issues, especially education and young people issues. And it's, frankly, I feel it's a privilege to be there at this time of development of world history and the way the economy of the world is forcing changes on everything. And I'll just stop there, and because I could just ramble on and on. What question is?
I probably forget the name of it, but a few years ago there was this famous letter that was sent by the Muslim community to the Christian community. It was called Common Word.
Mm-hmm.
Sent to all the churches, really. And it was a sort of reaching out to try to be more understanding and more cooperative, I guess. Did you notice any effect that might have had?
The problem was something like that. That was good because it was very broadly signed, if I can put it that way. But there is no coherent or single spokesperson for Islam. Islam is different in different places, and I mean, one of the things that I try to make in my book is Islam is not primarily a theology, it's a sociology. You can't separate Islam, Sharia, as a theological thing. And when we talk about denominations which are defined doctrinally, they talk about jurisprudence, how you interpret law. It's a very different way of defining identity and distinctions. And I mean, that's a fairly generalized way of talking about it. But for instance, even something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's not universal. I mean, you actually start looking at who has signed up and who has not, and for what reasons. We presume that a universal document of some kind, which has been largely subscribed, is therefore applicable to others who haven't subscribed. And that's the problem there, is for those who have subscribed, they're speaking for themselves. They're not in a position to speak for anyone else. If Pope Francis signs something, it becomes binding on the Catholic world. If Archbishop Welby signs something, it's not as binding in an Anglican context, but it's meaningful for Anglicans. There is no such network in Islam. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was very interested when you talked about the missing vocabulary, that the person you talked to didn't have Christian vocabulary. I mean, I'm a linguist, so that this is something that really interests me. But I was just wondering, what is actually a communal language? You talked about all these people speaking different languages, but when you meet, what is actually the language of choice?
Well, English is the commercial language.
Mm.
Okay, and if you're working on a building site, you wouldn't necessarily have to be fluent in English. But if you're working in any public capacity, you've got to have a level of English fluency that is functional.
Mm. But when Christians of different denominations come together, do they still speak all English then together?
Oh, no.
Or is there a desire to speak Arabic? Or?
No, as I was saying, in our building, we can do 18 congregations simultaneously, and
Okay.
quite often there'll be 18 different languages going.
All right.
Because people want to worship in their own
Yeah.
mother tongue, and then we want to facilitate that. Well, there are Arabic-speaking congregations because there are Syrian, Lebanese, Jordanian Christians in the Gulf in general. I tend to flip-flop, I'm sorry, between Qatar specifically and the Gulf in general. But in reality, it's a huge melting pot of nationalities. And Qatar,
When they meet, when the different nationalities meet, I think it's partly what you're getting at, what language do they use?
I think the question is how and when do they meet? Church is an aspect of multi-language, multinational meeting. But for the most part, nationality groups tend to work within their nationality groups. They tend to be ethnocentric. That's not really right. But if you got a big building project and you need 200 workers, well, you want them all to speak the same language. At least on certain levels. I mean, you may have, the engineers might be Arabs or let's say Brits, but it's really good to have all Nepalese or all Filipino people actually interacting with each other about, I need some more cement, or bring 3 bricks, or whatever it might be, so that functionality works. And even on the day off, they tend to gather in their own language groupings for social events, because they're celebrating their own cultural, social enjoyments. People coming together from a multitude of nationalities is always an intentionality involved. They're coming together to do something. And in that respect, English is the language that's used. But then, can I just, what English? Australian English, Scottish English, American English. I like to tell people I speak English and American. And I can spell both, but it's been hard. I've had to learn it, right? Your average Indian, there's more Indians who speak the Queen's English than English people. It's a very, very indefinable thing. Sorry.
Very interesting point about the conversation with the Arabic speaker. I mean, it reminds me of 1984, where language has controlled to such an extent that you can't think of subversive thought. And so I just wonder if you could gloss that a little bit. And say what ideas or what Christian concepts did you have to explain, just out of curiosity? And if I could ask you also a second question about anti-Semitism in the Arab world. It seems very obvious to me that it's very common in the Arab Street, so to speak. When I just one of the biggest publishers here, the tablet of this story, was sending atlases to Dubai. And okay, they were going through to the schools, but by the time they got through to the schools, Israel had been wiped off the map in every atlas. And so tells its own story, doesn't it?
Actually not. Let's come back to that.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Well, if you've got another angle on that, very interesting. Yeah. So there is a kind of modus vivendi with Christianity, the way you describe it. But I would imagine that relations with Judaism are of a completely different order, or don't exist. But perhaps you know better.
Okay. I've lost your first question.
The first question was about 1984 and the concepts of Christianity.
It seems like in Arabic,
Yes.
the word for bishop, okay, it's a fairly specific word.
Yeah.
And we in the Middle East tend to use the term Episcopal as opposed to Anglican. And so they've done a very interesting thing in Arabic called, and this was the Knesset Church, Anglicania. All right, or they've just taken the word Anglican.
Right.
But the actual word is Uscovia. And they don't know it because they've not been in an environment where that word is used. And that was one of the points of discussion. But then we got into, we talk about a church service. And so it's actually a literal translation of the word service. The same way that the same Arabic word that you would use, the service center for getting your phone fixed. It's very interesting the way the language works. A congregation in Arabic is the same word that's used when people come, for instance, as at a funeral or as at a wedding and gather together. Majma. It's any kind of a gathering. And so the way Arabic as a Semitic language deals with these concepts, it is a different kind of translation than the way English, which has developed that vocabulary out of Greek.
And the more, leaving aside bishop and services, what about the more theological concepts? I don't know, salvation, Messiah. Is it possible to converse in a sort of interfaith dialogue sort of way?
Yes, I mean all these words exist in Arabic. As I say, I mean the church was there before Muslims came in places like Egypt and Syria, and so all of those concepts, as Arabic became the lingua franca for the country, they acquired vocabulary, and sometimes they were borrowing words and things like this. Gulf Arabs, sometimes it's a little difficult. When I'm listening to the translation at a conference, I'm thinking, well, that's an interesting way to say that. But that's true from English to English in some things. Language is a live thing. It's not set. And so it's a difficulty that they usually get at an event like that, a Christian or a Jordanian to do the translation, because the Gulf Arabs aren't easily fluent with that vocabulary. Okay, so it's just a way of dealing with it. Your second question, in the Middle East in general, there is a antipathy towards the state of Israel. Most Arabs would make a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Okay. And make that distinction?
Absolutely universally. How clearly they understand the distinction is another story. I mean, different people would in conversation, and I certainly remember listening to the mosque preacher who, railing on Israel and therefore the Jews and all this kind of stuff. But he meant the Jews in terms of the Jewish government, much the same way that John's gospel refers to the Jews. I mean, John's a Jew, but when he talks about the Jews, he means the government establishment.
Yeah.
And in terms of the way that this diatribe happens, when it does, it isn't generally anti-Semitic against Jewish people. It's against the quote, the Jewish leadership of the Zionist state, which is the way they speak about it.
But when the Christians, if you look at the history of Christianity, where the anti-Semitism grew because of the interpretations that were popularized.
John's Gospel.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to believe that when someone preaches in that way, that it's not that the congregation, it's not heard as a condemnation of all Jews.
Okay, but to give you an honest and appropriate comparison, they say the same things about Americans. All Americans are bad. They're imposing their culture on us. They are taking away our values by bringing us McDonald's and whatever. Of course, McDonald's is always owned by a local, but it's seen as an imposition from American economic interests. And in my life in the Middle East, there's been a real disadvantage to being an American.
Is that linking with the great Satan from Iran, or is it different?
Very similar. Very similar. There was a period of time, 1990 to 1995, when Americans smelled okay. I say that facetiously, because of the way that America kind of led the way of the coalition to, if I might say, rescue Kuwait. But after September 11th, they're in everybody's bad graces again because of the carpet bombing in Iraq and the invasion, carpet bombing in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, and the way every intervention has been mishandled ever since. They're gracious enough to say to me, we understand you are an American and you don't control your government, but we don't like your government. It's the same thing. They don't like what the Israeli government does, they don't like what the American government does, and to a certain extent the British
Is
government.
it even under Obama, who has been sort of restrained in his friendship with Israel and has courted the Arab world to some extent in the Islamic world? You don't buy that?
Well, he hasn't delivered,
No.
and that's what they're concerned about. Iraq is still a mess. He's supporting the Saudis to bomb the Yemenis. He can't do anything right when it comes down to it.
John?
Talk about football for a minute. What are the challenges and plans that you have in the Christian Church there, preparing for the World Cup?
Preparing for the World Cup. In terms of Christian tourists,
Almost nothing. The people who work on building the infrastructure and the stadiums, I mean, when I say the infrastructure, it's roads, storm sewers, a metro system, the whole country is being developed in reference to preparing for the World Cup. And so a significant number of people who are attending the churches are there because their job in some way relates to this long-term planning. But are we as churches doing anything to plan for the World Cup? No. For one thing, it's still a long ways off.
I mean, I'm just thinking, hundreds, thousands of people will arrive. There's a spotlight on Qatar, back to human rights, back to what's the churches doing about it, particularly the local churches. A lot of people wanting to worship, perhaps over the during the course of those games. Isn't that a bit of a challenge?
Okay, I'm going to say we don't have freedom of religion. We have freedom to worship in the location which the government has permitted. When the government set up that system in 2005, total population of Qatar was 750,000 people. It's now 2.5 million. They know without a doubt that there is no way we can accommodate all the Christians on the land allocation that they've allowed. And I say, they drew a line and said, you can build here and you can build here. They have intimated to the Christian Church's steering committee that they know that there needs to be more church presence, space, availability to meet the current population, much less what might come in at the World Cup. We cannot initiate that discussion. That's got to come through the government. And we are in, I mean, speaking specifically about Qatar, but it's also true in Kuwait and other places, we are in constant conversation with the government about the need for more space for Christians to worship. And we're just talking about Christians in this case. In terms of interfaith awareness, most of the Gulf states don't have any designated place for Buddhists or Hindus because they're not katakadakali, the people of the book, which are permitted in the Quran. And so governments don't have any accommodation for them in their thinking. They know they should, and they know that we've got to do something about this, but it's a dynamic within their own populations of, well, we're allowing Christian churches because Islamic heritage, the Sunnah, the compilation of law and tradition, does say that they have a responsibility for the people of the book that are in their midst. But they don't have a Sharia responsibility for the people who are not people of the book. It's a very dynamic thing. So back to your actual question, are we preparing to be hospitable to people who want to come to church? In the sense that we always have visitors coming. Are we in a position to accommodate, an extra 200,000 or 300,000 people next week? We can't accommodate everybody who lives there now. So, I don't know.
I mean, did you have
Yeah.
And then Rona.
Okay, I have just, it's interesting what you said about the United States, because even right now, the last meeting of the last conference of the GCC, where they invited Morocco as a kingdom, as Jordan and Morocco, there were many kind of, they invited them many times to be part of the GCC, especially after the Arab Spring, because they had the same kind of responses and everything. And actually the discourse either of Salman, the King Salman or the King of Morocco were really kind of really opposite to United States diplomacy, either with the problem of Sahara in Morocco or with the issue of the relation between Iran and the United States right now. So actually I think that the suspicion or the kind of hostility towards the United States raising more and more as a kind of not really clear ally, if I can say it like that. The question that I want to answer, just a continuity of what we were talking about anti-Semitism. Is there any kind of competition, if I can say it really simplistically like that, any competition between hostility toward Jews and hostility toward Shia in the Gulf? Especially I remember, for example, the last war between Hezbollah and the Israeli army. Many Muslim scholars in the Gulf were claiming that actually they are more against Shias, they are more against Hezbollah than the Israeli army. And it was really surprising for many people in the Gulf at that time. I remember the huge discussion in Al Jazeera and many things. I was there young at that moment. But I want really to know the situation right now, if you have any idea about that. Especially after the killing of the scholar in Saudi Arabia, especially after, in this whole hegemony that was
1979.
Yeah.
Of course, and much of the focus, let's say pre-1979, in my personal experience, there was no mention of any problem between Shia and Sunni. Mm-hmm. Okay? After 79, the two events, the revolution in Iraq and the occupation of the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia, Mecca, by two different versions of Islamic extremism, got the ruling families worried. And that has simply percolated more and more over the years. Saudi's history in particular, the eastern province is more Shia than Sunni, and that's where the oil is. And so the Saudi ruling family has worked very hard to contain the Shia community, who are in fact the ones who are the workers in the oil fields. Very, very interesting tension between the tribes of Saudi Arabia. You have a similar dimension in Iraq. The Shia are on the eastern side, closer to Iran, and the Shia area has water, agriculture, and oil. The Kurdish area has water, agriculture, and oil, other minerals. The Sunni area has sand. And that's a lot of what the tensions are in Iraq right now, a lot. And that goes back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So they blame the Brits and the French for that. Okay? As you go down the Gulf, the problems, the political problems in Bahrain are totally Shia Sunni. Totally. Similarly in Kuwait, a lot of the dimension of struggle in Kuwait is this question about who belongs, who's really a Kuwaiti. Interestingly enough, it doesn't express itself in Qatar, in the Emirates, or in Oman in that way. But now it's become this sense of the Saudis in particular, but the Gulf states in general, feel that they're being surrounded by Iranian-inspired rebellions. The Houthis, Hezbollah, the Alawites, the Muqtada Sadr in Iraq. So there's the Shia-Sunni thing has become very much more a dominant issue than anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli. Until the Israelis do something in Gaza again, and then that all flares up. But the underlying percolating social issue is the Sunni-Shia issue. Does it involve us as expatriates, or even more specifically as Christians? No. No, we're not invited into that discussion in any way.
But what about the Lebanese, for example, or the Christian Lebanese? Or
I mean, I could express an opinion, but I have never lived in Lebanon.
Okay.
You know.
No, but the Christian Lebanese live in the Gulf, like in Qatar, for example, or.
I mean, of course, they have their opinions about Hezbollah.
Okay.
And Syria. In fact, what I'm hearing from Christian Lebanese is they're very proud of themselves that although they were oppressed by Syria for so many years, they have now accepted over 1 million Syrian refugees into their country and they're supporting them. So the Christian Lebanese are saying, this is the Christian thing to do, to forgive and to help people in need. And so they're looking at this purely from a theological and then therefore the social expression of that theology in terms of their historic problems with Syria. Hezbollah is another story, just because Hezbollah is not particularly anti-Christian in Lebanon. It's anti-Zionist and anti-Sunni. So the Christian Lebanese are not engaging in that. Now that's, as I say, that's an opinion. I've never lived there. I don't have an intimate sense of how it works.
Rona.
Yeah, you said earlier that you've kind of got the church for migrants and you've got the Qataris that aren't allowed to go. What position do people who are migrants but from other Arab countries, who are Muslim, have if they were to go to church and convert?
Well, conversion is out of the question.
Yeah.
Okay, any public expression of conversion. A personal change of mind that isn't publicly expressed, I mean, that, of course, has many different dimensions. But to answer your question specifically about Qatar, the security police guarding the church site doesn't let any non-Christian in. If the DHL delivery person is a Hindu, he's not allowed in. okay? This is a place for Christians. It's not specifically to keep Muslims out because they're afraid of conversion. It's to keep anybody out who might be anti-Christian. Okay? I deal a lot with people who are concerned about Muslims becoming Christians. And my answer to that is the very high-ranking Qatari said to me, we understand that Christianity is a proselytizing religion, just like Islam. And we respect that this is something you want to do. And you're welcome to do it, except you. Okay. What can he say?
Yeah.
What can he say?
Yeah.
And I think that the whole question of religious freedom for many people boils down to that one question. Are they allowed to convert, and are we allowed to specifically encourage them? There is so much more to discuss in the whole realm of religious freedom, or even worse, religious pluralism, because that's actually the bigger issue in a place like Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, because it is a Muslim country. They tolerate the sense of Islam, they tolerate the existence of other people. And they're welcome, but it's not what we would define as religious freedom, because our criteria for definition are different.
So are the Muslims allowed to convert to Christians?
Absolutely. And the Hindus and the Buddhists.
And do they make much attempt to do that?
Yeah. There's some rather intentional Islamic efforts.
People intimidated.
Do I feel
Are
intimidated?
people intimidated into converting to Islam?
No, there are advantages.
So it's a kind of intimidation.
Well, if you're a non-Muslim and you become a Muslim, there are advantages to being a Muslim in a Muslim country.
It's like the مؤلفة قلوبهم in the period of the Prophet, like giving grants or something in order to convert.
Yeah,
Is the tax imposed on, is the tax imposed on non-Muslims?
I don't want to overdo that, because yes, of course, there's always, we had the dimension which calls rice Christian converts in China, okay? And if you offer incentives, there will be conversions based on the incentives, which other people would question the sincerity. But the fact that there are incentives doesn't mean that the conversion wasn't real.
Is it interfaith-based schools in the UK where families go to particular areas, get the kids into Church of England or a Catholic school or whatever?
Yeah, whether or not they have any faith, but it's a better school.
Yeah.
Or perceived to be so. I think we need to be very careful that, yes, of course, Islam is a proselytizing religion, and there will always be, I'm constantly being offered the opportunity to become a Muslim because people like me. So they want me to be in heaven with them.
I'm constantly being offered the opportunity to become a Christian. So,
Yeah.
I sometimes feel that there's extra 5 points if I become a Christian. There must be 10 for you to become a Muslim.
We can work something out.
Maybe. I wanted you to touch on, before we finish, the question of the interfaith encounter. So you've talked a lot about life as a Christian and the challenges and the engagement with society, like in Islamic society. But I'm intrigued about, and I think it'd be interesting for people to hear a little bit about both the official dialogues, the sort of elitist, if you like, and also what's going on underneath that, which of course, you know, with our project is part of what we're looking at. But I think if you could share some thoughts, I think that would be very helpful.
Interfaith dialogue, in the official sense, is always social. How can we work together to better equip youth to deal with the masses of information that's coming through social networking? How can we work together as faith-based groups to help those in need? Okay. Interfaith dialogue in our part of the world is not, let's sit down and talk about what we mean about the Trinity. We don't do that kind of academic approach. It's social cooperation. And again, from an Islamic point of view, that is much more where people live together in an interfaith context. They don't live in this academic level of interfaith discussion. I would say, and I've tried to promote this idea as broadly and strongly as possible, when I pay for my groceries and the person who's accepting my money is a Muslim, my interaction with that person is an interfaith reaction, especially if I'm wearing this. But there's a sense of your identity is very, your religious identity, your social identity, your nationality is all very much part of any interchange in a multinational thing like that. But, okay, if we just take the English language Anglican congregation, which is 34, 38 nationalities, depending on which weekend we're looking at people in church, 98% of them aren't concerned, or they're not conscious of that interaction. They don't think of the fact that I, as a Christian, am relating to and representing Christianity in the way I pay my bill at the grocery store, or express anger at the other driver, or, you know, but that's interfaith as well, because that's the impression we give to each other.
So you're saying they're doing it without knowing it?
Absolutely. I mean, interfaith work is much more than the intentional sit down and discuss type of work. But, I mean, each of the Gulf countries has an official interfaith expression, and official church leaders are always invited to participate. But it's always driven from their side because it's their country. And that's a fairness. If we initiate something, it needs to be understood why we would be initiating something. It's their country. But when they want to do an interfaith thing, at least in my experience, quite often they will call me up and say, we want to do an interfaith thing, what do you think we should talk about? Can you help us work together to decide who the speakers are? And things like this. When they want to do something interfaith, they work at it being interfaith. So I think, does that answer your question?
Austin's not said.
When you talk about social and social action in terms of interfaith encounter, is this social action that actually happening out in the cities beyond the walls and allocated space for other religions? Or like if you're handing out food, or if you're helping the homeless as an interfaith activity, is that allowed to happen outside this allocated space?
That's not allowed to happen at all.
Okay.
That's a government prerogative. Partly because the social dynamics are so completely different. You don't live in the Gulf unless you've got a job. There's no homeless, of course, that does happen. And there are people who find themselves in between jobs and things like that. But the economy is so different. Where there are situations of what I would call exploitation or abuse, and people are hungry and needy, the government actually feels it's their responsibility to fill that gap, and we simply have to let them know. That's the way they approach it. I was actually in a meeting with the Emir and Rowan Williams when he was Archbishop, and this subject came up. And the Emir was just startled to think, why would the churches be interested in this? What's the church got to do with that? We take care of the people. And I expressed to him that if a Muslim student in Arizona found himself at odds with his landlord, where would he go for help? He would go to the local mosque. And His Highness said, oh, yeah, okay. But it's just not in the scope of social action like we do in Western countries to help the poor. They don't do it that way. It's part of the zakat system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right, we'll take the two questions together because this will be the last one. If you very quickly, Amin and Miriam, does anybody else wanted to ask a question? No, we'll have those two together and then we'll let them.
Yeah, very quickly, just do non-Muslims have access to mosques in Qatar?
Just hold that. Oh, well, that's the quick answer. Great.
Yeah.
Miriam?
I'm just wondering, how much is the interfaith dialogue driven by pragmatic concerns? Because we here in England, in Germany, you feel threatened if you have a 40th of your population coming in people of different faiths, right? I mean, you said it's 10 to 1, so being overwhelmed by 10 times more people, then you must feel culturally extremely threatened, which then translates into policies. And how much do you think is interfaith, so the desire to do interfaith work, driven by a pragmatic need to actually regulate life in Qatar?
I would say the official interfaith work throughout the Gulf, Qatar in particular, has a lot more to do with supporting the reputation of the country as being open and welcoming. They want people to feel welcome to come, so they do public things which express that openness. They approach the whole business of being overwhelmed by foreign influence in very different ways, but that's not part of what we would think of as the interfaith work that's being done officially.
Saudi Arabia definitely doesn't do that, of course.
They don't do it in Saudi Arabia.
No.
They try to do it in Vienna.
In Vienna with the,
Yeah.
Yes.
not very well in Vienna with
Well,
that place.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, Saudi Arabia, even when you speak to Muslims in the Gulf, they would characterize it the way my wife and I talk about it. If you take the issue of religious freedom or interaction, Qatar would be 4 out of 10, Bahrain would be 8 out of 10, Oman 9 out of 10, Kuwait 5 out of 10, Saudi's 50. It's just off the map. When I was living there, I had a conversation with a member of the royal family, one conversation that I had, and the subject of churches being built came up. And I was told, as far as the royal family is concerned, we would be happy for you to build churches. But if you did someone to blow it up, and a lot of people would get hurt. So we're not ready for that yet. I thought that was a pretty straight, honest approach. The fact is, in Saudi Arabia, there isn't a sense of coherent sociology. It's still very tribal, and the mutawa'in, the enforcers of religious values, some of them are so connected to the royal family and the values that are being promoted. Some of them are simply self-appointed vigilantes, and they have guns. They're dangerous.
Well, Bill, I think finishing on the statement about being concise and honest, very much summarises what you've done for us. I think everybody's got an insight into the situation in Qatar, in the Gulf, in a very constructive way, in a clearer way than some of the media accounts that we have on our computer screens. I mean, I thought it was very interesting what you said about the difference between freedom of religion and the freedom of worship. And I'm going to really have to think a little bit about that. I thought that was quite intriguing. So thank you from me personally for that, and I'm sure everyone else has got bits and pieces to pick up on as well. I would like to mention, before I close, a conference that the Wolf Institute is co-sponsoring called Reconsidering Religious Radicalism, which is on the 21st of May. And it has some excellent speakers, Maurice Glassman, Peter Mandeville from the States, Nick Adams, and Mona Siddiqui, amongst others. And that's at Clare. I'm not sure where it is. I think it's at Clare College, but it's online anyway. So really, thank you very much for your time, and we're very, very grateful. Thank you.